Hello and welcome to my channel, everybody. September was a rather strange month for me somehow. It was both a really nice month in terms of traveling with my friend Catalina. I will link the travel and reading vlog to Prague and Krakow up here. But it was also a kind of more difficult month. So Catalina and I went to the Auschwitz concentration camp, which I still don't really feel like I can talk about because I still haven't sorted my thoughts about this very much. And it was also the month that I had all 4 of my wisdom teeth out. So I looked a little bit like a hamster for a while. I'll see if I can insert a picture of that here. But I think both the traveling and the being ill at home, not being able to do anything else, actually meant that I got a lot of reading done. So in terms of reading, it was a really, really good month. And so I actually finished 7 books in September, which is quite a lot for me. I'm generally averaging around 5 or so per month. And so I wanted to talk you through the books I read. The first book I finished in September was The Librarian of Auschwitz, which, as the title suggests, is set in the Auschwitz concentration camp and follows the real-life story of a girl called Dita Kraus, who becomes the librarian in the family camp in Auschwitz. And when we were visiting Auschwitz, I actually saw where the family camp was, and it was a very surreal experience to be listening to the audiobook of this and to be able to walk in the same paths and in the same places that she walked in. And yes, as I said, I'm still struggling to put my feelings and experiences of that into words. While we were in Auschwitz, I also bought myself this book called Auschwitz, A History by Sybille Steinbacher. It's a non-fiction book talking about the setup of the camps, the operation of them, the extermination process, as well as the trials following the liberation. So it was very, very hard to read in a sense, because having been there, it obviously felt a lot more immediate to read this and to know where the places that the author was talking about actually are, and to actually have walked between the barracks, to have walked along the Lagerstrasse, to have seen the place where the selections took place. I'll be making a dedicated video about my experiences visiting Auschwitz, as well as the Librarian of Auschwitz book, because I wanted to put the two of them together, because to me, in a sense, that story is a really accessible way of understanding what life and death in the Auschwitz concentration camp were like. Onto some more light-hearted reading that I did in September. So I was on a 26-hour coach journey from where I live to Prague and then on to Krakow and back again, obviously. And so I got a lot of reading done on that coach, because fortunately I can read on a coach. I'm so happy about that. And prior to going on the trip, I had finally bought myself Illuminae, which I'd heard so much about, but had never seen or never really felt the urge to buy until I went to a bookshop and saw it lying there and just decided that now is the time for me to read Illuminae. And oh my gosh, I loved this book. It was so amazing. I whizzed through this. I mean, it's a big chunk of a book. I think it is close to 700 pages. It's 600 pages pretty much. And so the story follows the 2 characters called Ezra and Katie, who have just broken up and then their planet gets attacked. So it's a science fiction story, obviously. And so it follows these 2 characters as they're trying to uncover what happened to their planet, why it was attacked, and how to save their lives and the lives of their families. And it's told in such an interesting way, because unlike most books, it doesn't have a normal narrative in that sense, but instead it consists of chat messages, emails, file reports, and it's just, I loved reading it. It felt like reading a documentary, and I know that sounds kind of strange because that's a very unusual way to read, obviously, but I absolutely loved reading this style. It was so different. And I might have just ordered myself the 2nd book in this series because I'm so excited about reading it. Next up, I mentioned in my Finally Fall video that I finally got my mum into reading Harry Potter. And I feel very proud of myself for that. And because my mum was so excited about reading it and kept messaging me how much she loved the books, I decided that it was high time that I pick up Harry Potter again as well. And so I've been reading Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which I think is, as far as I know, my favourite book of the series. But it has been about 10 years or so since I last read it, or well, read it for the first time, because I'd never actually reread it. And so I don't know, maybe some of the other ones are actually now my favourite. But so I finished Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban in September. I'm currently on the Goblet of Fire, obviously, and I can't wait to get through the rest of the series again. It's so nice to be reminded of all the excitement and scary moments and the friendship and just the whole universe of Harry Potter that I hadn't really been in for such a long time. So yay, I'm so happy to be back in there. Next up, there are another 3 audiobooks that I listened to in September because, as I was mentioning, I was quite ill for a little while, and so I didn't really always feel like reading a physical book, but audiobooks are absolutely great for that. And so the first one of those was Seafire by Natalie C. Parker, which is kind of a pirate story, like Pirates of the Caribbean meets Wonder Woman is how I've heard it described before. So it follows Caledonia, whose family was killed by Eric O'Hare. And so she's created this all-female, all-girls crew who are out to try to take Eric down. I really enjoyed the story in terms of it's an adventure story. It is definitely plot-driven. There's a lot of things going on there. And what it made me think about was how, on a deeper level, there are some very interesting questions there about who do we trust? Do we trust the people who are most similar to us? So in this case, all the girls on the ship are all female, obviously, and so there's a certain distrust towards anybody who's not female, like Eric and his crew. And there's also addressing this question of whether we should act out of fear or out of hope. So whether our fundamental instinct is to go with, oh, I will not do this because I'm afraid of it, or whether it should be more like, well, I'll give it a chance. We can see what happens. Maybe something good will happen. And I think the book kind of put this in a very interesting way in terms of, do we give people a chance and think that they might change, or do we assume that because they are who they are now, we have to always avoid them and always be afraid of them? So overall, I really enjoyed Seafire. I think it had some very strong female characters in it, which obviously I always love. I think the ending could have been slightly more resolved. I wasn't quite sure, in a sense, what happened at the ending. So that was my only criticism of the book, I think. But overall, I really, really enjoyed this. I also listened to Vox by Christina Dalcher, which I did a whole review video about that I'll be linking up here. So this book follows Dr. Jean McClellan, who is a neurolinguist, living at a time in which women are only allowed to speak 100 words per day. So, as you can tell, this is a dystopian novel. I hope so anyway. Then suddenly there is a neurological emergency with the president's brother, and Jean is asked to help try to fix his aphasia, so his inability to produce normal speech. However, things turn out not to be quite as they seem, and the book kind of turns into a thriller. So overall, I really enjoyed this. I wish that it had explored a little bit more maybe what it is like to live under this oppression, which, yes, there are definitely a lot of horrific things being mentioned, such as premarital or extramarital sex, leading to any words being taken away, so you have to be completely silent, and LGBT folks being imprisoned and forcefully married off to a heterosexual partner, and just all sorts of things like that, which are rather terrifying. And I can see how some people might say that the book is slightly against men. I'm not sure that I personally agree, because there are some very strong male characters in the sense that they really stand up for equal rights and they fight against this oppression. But obviously this is a really terrifying book, but I love my dystopian fiction. And it actually also made me look up some of the aphasia topics that I mentioned in the book. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed listening to this. And lastly, I just finished When Elephants Fly, and that book actually made me cry, which is something that happens very, very rarely. It's a very, very intense story. There are probably some trigger warnings in there, so it deals with mental health issues. So obviously, if that is something that you find difficult, then just be aware that there are a lot of mental health issues in there, because it follows an 18-year-old character called Lily Decker, whose mum had tried to kill her when she was 7 years old because she was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. And so, because this might be genetic, Lily has a 12-year plan that involves avoiding any kind of stress, upheaval, or too deep emotions, and just trying to get on with her life until she is 30 and until she knows that she did not inherit her mum's schizophrenia. However, things don't go quite as planned when she witnesses a baby elephant in her local zoo almost being killed by its own mum. And so obviously that brings back a lot of memories from her own childhood. And as someone who is trying to become a journalist, she then gets involved with the story of this baby elephant. And it brings up all sorts of questions for her in terms of what is worth fighting for. What does it mean to sacrifice something? And she begins to ask herself what kind of things are worth taking risks for, even if it risks her very sanity. So I don't know what it is like to live with that weight of schizophrenia hanging over you, to not know what is real and what is not real. But the book beautifully and with a lot of sensitivity describes this. So there is definitely this scary thing that is constantly on her mind, that she's constantly checking in if she's hearing voices, if she's having hallucinations, if she's starting to act in a way that is not how she normally acts. But despite all these very difficult topics, the story is really full of hope, as well as exploring Lily's growing sense of what is worth living for and what it's worth sacrificing and making commitments for. It's also a story of being brave and when faced with an uncertain future, which is definitely what Lily's life is like at that moment. And I think how she deals with this, despite being afraid, despite all the things that she cannot in any way control, she continues to be strong in the face of all that. And I just found it a really inspiring book that really highlights mental health issues in a way that doesn't seem patronizing and doesn't seem stereotypical, but instead makes them really personal. It makes them really relatable. And I feel that in the end, one of the most important points of that book is that yes, we might be faced with things that we cannot control, whether that's genetic, inheriting mental health issues, or any other things that we are in no control over. However, what really matters in the end is more how we live our lives and what we choose to make sacrifices for, what we choose to invest our time and energy in. And I think that book just beautifully illustrates that. So these were all the books that I read in September. Let me know in the comments below what some of your favourite books in September were, or what you're planning to read in October. Until next time, bye! Also, can I just say, I love the floppy American versions of books.